Mike Sfraga is director of the Polar Initiative at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He joins us to talk all things Arctic. Mike, welcome aboard.
Thank
I
you for
should say
having me.
that,
Yeah,
since you're our newest director.
I am. Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
2 months feel like 2 years?
2 months feels like 2 years, but in a very good way. I
Good,
think we've
good.
covered a lot of good ground in a couple of months.
But before we ask you about some Arctic issues and some of the things you've been doing, tell us a bit about yourself and your connection to the region.
Well, my connection to the region started in 1978 when I left New York for an adventure that lasted until now. So I've been in Alaska more or less for almost 40 years. And my connection there has been both academically at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, but as any other Alaskan, most transplanted Alaskans, you come for a little bit for an adventure and you wind up staying, if you adapt to the environment, you wind up staying for a very long time. So my time started in 1978, and like many people with a backpack and a trunk, and your life evolves, your family evolves, your world evolves, and you wind up becoming a true Alaskan.
Was a New York boy ready for that harsh environment, speaking of the environment?
New York boy was ready for it, he thought. I was ready for the adventure, but like being presented the oncoming onslaught of a winter
Yeah.
was something that
There's
New York
theory
City
and then there's minus 50.
and relativity, everything's relative. There is minus 50, but took it with kind of a great pride that you can actually survive a winter at 50
Yeah.
below zero, where others who had been there for decades simply smiled at the newcomers. But it is a very different environment. It's a very loving landscape. It's a beautiful landscape, but it's a pretty ferocious landscape
Demanding
as
place
well.
as well. So talk to us about the emerging issues that are becoming more and more prominent from that region of the globe. Where are the hotspots? I know it sounds like a pun, but what are the issues that are most prevalent? And talk to us about the arc of these becoming regional issues and now evolving into global issues.
Yeah, thank you. So there is an evolving arc of issues. Some have been there for quite some time, and simply now the news is at a point where you hear more about it. I've joked around that 15 years ago you couldn't get people to an Arctic meeting, whatever it was, whether it was climate change or social issues. Now if you throw a dart at a calendar, there's an Arctic meeting. It's in Sheboygan, it's in Miami, it's in Fiji, it's in Singapore. So that tells you something, that the Arctic now has been globally connected to other issues, whether it's climate change or socioeconomic issues, the price of oil, security issues and military movements around the Arctic. So these now have become part of the mainstream discussion on whatever the topic is. Part of that is because of climate change, this focus on the changing environment all over the world, but in the Arctic, it's twice as fast as anywhere else on the globe. It's real and it's palpable and it's rapid.
Are there climate deniers in the Arctic the same way there are in the lower 48?
I think there are climate deniers in the Arctic, scientists who believe that there are some natural swings, and there are natural swings, but you have to look at what the trends are. So there's one thing called weather, which is what happens here, and there's something else called climate, which is that long-term trend. So there are deniers of man-induced climate change. There are not
No
deniers,
deniers of the reality of what you're seeing at your back door.
Correct. It's cause and effect. Yeah. So there are questions yet remaining. But the vast majority of scientists, the vast majority of researchers point to human-induced climate change has accelerated the change that may have happened naturally, but the acceleration is extraordinary, nothing we've seen before in human history. And when you go back through the ice records, whether it's from Greenland or Antarctica, you see this trend line, which is incredible. So, and at a time when you could have rapid change, we weren't around. Mm-hmm. Other species had to evolve. There was an ice age, humans evolved. But the scale of change, and we've built a civilization, the one you and I know. We've built insurance policies. We have built a fuel-based resource economy. We have
Based
built
on assumptions that are changing.
based on what we thought was the way things were and always would be. But now the climate is changing so rapidly, whereas you could have a village in northwest Alaska that has been there forever, and everything has been fine. It's been in balance. There have been changes, but species have come and gone. Subsistence has been fairly reliable. There have been droughts. There have been other issues that naturally happen. But what we're seeing is this incredible pace of change when a civilization has built structures, houses, banks, basic sanitation. But if that ground is literally shifting under the feet of communities, big and small, everything has changed now, which is what's happening in many places in Alaska, so and throughout the Arctic. And the other thing is there are different Arctics. There's the North American Arctic, the one you might think of when you think of Alaska, Canada, and Russia. There's also the Nordic countries. They have a very different Arctic. Scandinavia has a very different Arctic. So one might be influenced by the Gulf Stream. You have a very temperate climate. One is not influenced by the Gulf Stream. So you look at Russia, Canada, and Alaska, and you see very different Arctic physically, environmentally, climate-wise. So they're very different Arctics. There isn't just one.
All these countries, what's the level of cooperation? I know that you recently encountered Vladimir Putin making remarks about Russia's interests in the region.
Yeah. Well, I think the good thing about the Arctic is that it's still a zone, I think, a zone of peace and dialogue. You have the Arctic Council, the 8 Arctic nations that speak at the highest levels of government often, and I mean weekly, on very different issues, and that's been around for about 20 years. So this zone of peace and engagement has sustained itself for 20 years, and I can think of no better time to keep that in place than now. So the Arctic really remains this place, maybe the only region where we speak quite often and collaborate with Russia and the rest of the other 7 Arctic nations. So it's quite a good story about the Arctic Council, the engagement on programs like agreements, binding agreements on Coast Guard's search and rescue. Well, that's to everyone's interest. The Arctic is changing. More tour ships will happen throughout the Arctic. More transport, goods and services throughout the Arctic is occurring. But you need a search and rescue interoperability agreements throughout the 8 Arctic nations. We have that. There is a binding agreement on the table to be signed next month, hopefully in Fairbanks, at the ministerial meeting of the Arctic Council, where the U.S. will transition its chairmanship from the United States to Finland. Part of that discussion...
2-year term?
2-year term. Part of that discussion is a binding agreement on scientific research. Extraordinary, because scientists have not been able to travel the Arctic in a free way so that they can cross borders to do their research. That will be one thing in that agreement, that scientists can collaborate and go across borders and share information, and many other things in an agreement like this. So this world of the Arctic, dynamic, changing, there's opportunities and challenges, but it is a zone of discussion at the highest levels and a zone of peace still, even though there are some who think that there are some, and there are legitimate Arctic security issues.
Not that I'm fishing for trouble,
No.
but with these opportunities, where does the cooperation kick in and where does this get less cooperative?
So you might see less cooperation on areas of territorial rights. So we have overlapping claims throughout the 8
Sea
Arctic
lands,
nations.
resources.
Yeah, and how far out the continental shelf extends and what one country claims as their continental shelf. There's resources out there. There's sovereignty issues out there. Oil and gas, minerals, rare metals, rare earth metals. So that's all in a nation's best interest to claim as far out of that continental shelf as they possibly can. There are overlapping claims. Those will all be decided in international courts. That's a good thing. But there could be conflict there, especially if resources are significant, and there are significant oil and gas resources throughout the Arctic. So, but right now you have a structure for discussion and adjudication of those claims. So that could be one pressure point. Another pressure point, frankly, is the growing interest of the Arctic from observer nations. We call them observer non-Arctic nations. China, Singapore, Korea, these are not militaries moving in with great force. These are transport systems. These are very large container vessels moving throughout the Bering Strait and shipping goods and services destinational, but also from the Northern Sea Route down through the Bering Strait into Asia. Now, that's not conflict. However, there is a growing concern about Russia's increase in their rehabilitation of many of the bases that were scuttled after the Soviet Union fell. So you will hear that those who believe, mostly the Russian representatives will say, what we're doing in the Northern Sea Route and in the Arctic, the Russian Arctic, is simply rehabilitating many of our structures and assets that went by the wayside during the fall of the Soviet government. Others view a buildup of Russian bases and capacity in the north as something far different. They see that as projection of force. And so how the other nations react to that is of great importance. We should be, in my opinion, we should be cognizant of this. I don't think we should overreact to this, but I think we should have our assets and our own capabilities in place. So my opinion is that Canada, the United States, the other Arctic nations should be cognizant of a Russian build-out, should have the right assets in place, especially in Alaska. We're geostrategic to the rest of the United States and to our allies. So we should be careful of this, but I don't know that we should overreact about it either.
I know that you had Lisa Murkowski here, a senator who represents a state who is well versed in these issues. But what about the rest of the U.S. government and the U.S. Congress? How up to speed are they on the issues that you're describing?
Yeah, I would like to say that they are as equally versed as Senator Murkowski as they are not. Senator Murkowski and Senator King from Maine have taken a great interest in the Arctic. They co-chair the Arctic Caucus of the Senate, and that is a very good tool for our senator and for anyone interested in the Arctic because they keep amplifying the importance of the Arctic, and that's everything from national security to resource development to sustainable communities. So both senators have done a wonderful job of keeping the Arctic narrative alive. Frankly, you've got to tell senators and congressmen why they should care.
Sure.
And so why should a senator from Iowa care? I think a senator from Iowa, I've picked Iowa for whatever reason. You can pick Nebraska, your favorite state, but why should other senators and other citizens of the country care about the Arctic? They should care about the Arctic because of the following: global weather patterns, droughts, the cost of energy, national security, and I can keep going. So all of those things are of interest, I think, to the other 49
Not a
states.
state in the union that doesn't care about those things.
Not a state in the union, not a country that doesn't care about
country,
those things.
no.
So the price of oil is a global commodity. Alaska has vast resources in there. That's why we should care. We should care about all of those things.
A final quick thought, Mike, is about a major event that you have planned. What preview can you give us of the June event that you're planning?
Thank you. So the Arctic Circle was started by President Grimson of Iceland and Alice Rogoff many years ago. And it occurs every October in Reykjavik, Iceland. It's like a big tent for Arctic discussions. It's fantastic. They noticed that there were Arctic meetings all over the world. This was their way of bringing everybody to Reykjavik in October and have cross discussions. It's fantastic. Over 2,000 people come to that. Then they've sort of franchised this idea. I call them Arctic Circlettes. They call them Arctic Circle Forum. And they've had one in Nuuk. They've had one in Quebec. They've had one in Anchorage, Alaska. They've had one in Singapore. We're going to hold one here in Washington, D.C. These are smaller versions of the big tent, usually focused on a particular theme. So working with President Grimson and Alice Rogoff, our theme will be U.S.-Russia in the Arctic. How fitting, what a great time for it. And that will occur on June 21st and the 22nd. It will be open to the public. We'll have panels on security, on cooperation in the Arctic, science and research. So we'll focus our Arctic Circle Forum on this interesting relationship between the U.S. and Russia in the Arctic and how it impacts the other Arctic 8 nations, but also global communities.
I should tell people watching us who are in the D.C. area that if they come to wilsoncenter.org, they can get the details about what Mike is describing and can attend. And if not, there'll be some webcasts, so you can join us via video.
There will be. Yeah.
Mike, thank you very much. You know, I based on everything you're telling me, I know you're going to be back in this seat a lot. Welcome aboard, and thanks for sharing with us all this exciting information about this emerging new host of issues from this part of the globe.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, and I really appreciate the time to talk about these important issues.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.